Thank you for joining us for today's discussion on India's higher education in the time of the great pandemic and beyond. I am Pushkar, Director of the International Center, Goa. We have with us three very accomplished and distinguished academics and former university heads. Professor Ashok Misra has joined us. He is the former director of IIT-Bombay. He was a director for 2 terms from 2000 to 2008. And he is currently the National Academy of Sciences Distinguished Professor at the Indian Institute of Science, IISc in Bangalore. Professor Ramaswamy is our second panelist. He is the former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Hyderabad and past President of the Indian Academy of Sciences. He taught for more than 3 decades at the School of Physical Sciences and the School of Computational and Integrative Sciences at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Finally, we have with us Dr. Manisha Priyam, Associate Professor at the Department of Education Policy, National University of Educational Planning and Administration, NUEPA in New Delhi. Manisha is the author of The Contested Politics of Education Reforms in India, Aligning Opportunities with Interests, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. On behalf of the International Center Goa, I would first like to thank all of you for making time for this session. So thank you very much. Let me begin the session with some very brief remarks. I'll just make 3 points very quickly, after which I'll pose about 5 or 6 questions. Our estimate is it would take about 60 to 75 minutes, after which you'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. I think there are 3 main reasons why this discussion on India's higher education in the context of the great pandemic is extremely relevant. First, as we all know, India aspires, especially the 21st century India, aspires to be a knowledge power and to be acknowledged globally as such. Now, this requires massive improvements in the education sector, in schooling as well as in college and university education. What we have seen over the past decade or so is surely a lot of improvements in some areas, not so much in others, but much more needs to happen. So the first aspect, of course, is that, as I just mentioned, is that to aspire to be a knowledge power, to become one, there needs to be massive improvements in schooling as well as in higher education in colleges and universities. The second point is that India has the largest young population in the world. Gross enrollment ratio in higher education is in excess of about 26%, and there are more than 37 million students. Now, these numbers will continue to increase over the coming decade. Will probably reach up to 50 to 60 million students over the next 5 to 10 years. Now, access to education as well as the quality of education is crucial for these very large numbers of young people, not just those attending college, but also those who will complete their class 10, their schooling, etc., and enter the labor market. Not only their life chances depends on what kind of education they get, but also India's prosperity pretty much depends on education, on the kind of education we are able to impart to these young people. The third point is that the great pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has thrown unexpected challenges. Now, we all know that, for example, everyone immediately switched to online education. But more than that, the long-term costs of the pandemic may be very, very high, and we are still counting. So in the post-pandemic phase, certainly as far as public education is concerned, as far as the government's focus on education, higher education is concerned, there will be several other priorities. For example, the government may want to invest more in finding different ways to generate employment or to address the social costs of the pandemic. Now, given that we are still in the middle of a health crisis, it becomes necessary to inquire as to what will happen to the higher education sector in this context. So after these 3 very quick remarks, let me turn to the panelists with my first question, which is a very odd sort of a question, a very general question, and please feel free to take about 5 to 6 minutes because it's a question with a pretty large scope. what do you see as the three main challenges in India's higher education sector today? If any of them are specific to the current pandemic, that's all right. But as of now, what are the three main challenges that you see in the higher education sector? And we'll begin with Professor Ashok Misra first.
Thank you, Dr. Pushkar, for inviting us and taking a very important subject to this level. Pandemic has taken India towards a great leap in the digital world. May it be education at all levels, working of the government, meetings and so on. I'm not going to elaborate all of it. Board and other meetings of the corporate world, conferences, national and international, everything is happening online. Suddenly we have become a hugely digital country, just taken a huge leap in that direction. I just wanted to give that as a background. And this has affected the education system greatly. All the classes at all levels, whether it's secondary education, higher education, and many other places, education is now being taken care of by lectures and courses through the web. Teaching and learning process has changed through the cloud services, through Zoom, Microsoft Teams, WebEx, and whatever. Now, let me just say a little bit on the positive side. What have been some of the advantages? One of the things that I've seen, in fact, in my own experience teaching two courses in the last 2 semesters at ISC, is that I have to make my slides and the presentation to be of a much higher quality. So the teaching process or the transmission of knowledge has gone a little leap forward, because I can't just go on the blackboard with some old notes and write something. It has to be in a good PowerPoint, sometimes with videos and so on. So therefore, that's a very good thing that is happening. Lectures are recorded. So for the students who sometimes have to miss because of one reason or the other, can go back and look at the lecture. Or if they have missed something, they have doubts, they can re-look at the lecture. So that's a good thing that's happening. Innovations on online examinations are taking place, especially if the classrooms are small. Then you can do term papers, and you can do, instead of a written question paper where people can, consult with each other through WhatsApp and so many other things, so many other modes. This is one-on-one Viva you can do, but this can't be done on a very large class. So this is the biggest challenge, is that if you're teaching a class of 200, 300 students, let's say chemistry 101 at an IIT, which has now 300 odd people in the class, how do you test them? How do you rate them? And we do know that testing is important. All students are not assimilating the knowledge, even in the classroom situation, as well as you expect them to. So therefore, there are grades of A, B, C, D, and so on. So the biggest challenge is how to make sure that you have transmitted your knowledge in this new teaching learning process, and how to assess that. The positive thing is that, since mostly students are keeping their videos off and they are not seen. I have seen this, that some people who are shy students, and they would normally not ask a question in a classroom situation, are asking questions in the e-mode of learning. So that's a plus thing. Challenges are also quite, like I said, testing is one challenge. Network issues is huge. I mean, you're sitting in Goa and you had some problem with the network issue just now. Network issues in big cities are problems. Some of the students are now sitting at home in small towns, sometimes in villages, and the networks and the signals are not good enough. So sometimes in the middle of the lecture, they may be locked out, but fortunately they can visit the lecture that they've missed. There are disturbances. Some of them are coming from small families, and they don't have, like all of you have a room that we are doing this call from, but all of them don't have the luxury of having a room in which there is nobody else moving around. So disturbances are there. The biggest challenge is that, that eye contact, I've been a teacher all my life. Eye contact is missing. You get a feedback. There's a feedback loop. You see the students dozing off or not dozing off and asking questions, and you see their bright eyes and so on. This you don't see. And the biggest challenge is the uncertainty. We started this in last March, and we said, okay, it'll be all right, but July, September, December, next March has come, next April has come, and we are worse off than the previous last year's March. When will this all change? Will we eventually go to teaching and learning in this mode for a very long time? And that is a difficult part, as we have to address that. When will this all end? When will the pandemic finish? They keep talking about strains and new strains and third wave, and there was no talk of second wave in January, but now they're talking of the third wave. Who knows, there'll be a fourth wave and so on. So one has to worry about that. So the whole paradigm has changed. And I still like the teaching in a classroom because of the interaction with the students. But as I said, going online, I think my quality of teaching has improved. The other disadvantage in teaching online is that normally when a lecture would take 1 hour in the class, online, many people are not asking questions, no disturbances. So I finish the lecture in 40 minutes. And what do you do for the next 20 minutes? And so on. So these are also challenges as we go along. So I think we'll leave it at that, and then let others come in and whatever else questions come. Thank you.
Professor Ramaswamy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pushkar, for having me. Well, you asked what the challenges to Indian higher education were with or without a pandemic to help us along, right? So let me go from the point of view of what has been a problem for Indian higher education. I mean, the first to my mind is that money. India has not been putting as much money as it should have or could have into the whole process of higher education, given the fact that there is a very high correlation between the amount of money or the amount of funding in higher education and the general well-being of the country. I believe that we should have invested much more in education and in research. The input into research correlates very, very directly with the GDP and the well-being of a country. And this has not been true for a while now, not in absolute numbers and not in terms of purchasing power parity or in terms of foreign exchange, what have you. The actual money has been going down. This has actually meant that the gross enrollment ratio that we want, that has not been achieved, and it is actually becoming more and more difficult for us to think in terms of getting to that number. So let me just say the one point over here is funding and support. The second thing where I personally have felt that a lot of the problems of Indian higher education come with the fact of not having, it doesn't have a very quick reaction time. So our syllabi don't change, our curricula don't change. In most universities, I'm not talking about some select universities, some, there are institutions, IIT-Bombay being one, which I can, which can react very well to changing modes, the IITs in general. But by and large, many of our universities, particularly state universities and the smaller ones, do not adapt to the changing educational, or they don't change with knowledge. So that much of the education that we are imparting our students today is effectively unchanged over the last 20 or 30 years, maybe even more. And this means that our students are less and less prepared to cope with the real world with the world, with 2021. There is, I'm not saying that our education is irrelevant, but its relevance is not guaranteed and people don't work hard enough for it. The third one, which has to do in some sense with money, but not really, is to do with access. I feel that for too long, we haven't paid enough attention to how we are going to really educate the people that we have. And let me tell you, in my mind, what those problems are. As we grow further into the into the Republic of India, more and more of our students are first-generation learners. Most of our students who are coming into university now, in the bulk of our universities, do not come from either educated families or very literate families, which means that the demands that that are made on them by the system and the demands that they make of the system, they're not very well matched. And this means that, this, to my mind at least, this means that we are not actually reaching this target that we want of educating large numbers of our people. So you asked for three problems, Dr. Pushkar, and in my mind, okay, let me just flag those as three problems.
Can I just butt in for 1 second? Since Professor Ramaswamy talked about money, and I recently did this exercise, the contribution of the central government towards higher education is equivalent to $5.5 billion. And the budget of one university, Stanford, is $6 billion.
Right.
So that's the disparity.
Yeah, that is the disparity. Thank you, Ashok.
Dr. Priyam, would you like to take a shot at this question, the three main challenges facing India's higher education?
Yeah, I mean, such wealth of experience coming my way. So I obviously will resort to the scholarship that I do and what I gather from my research. And let me begin with what I think are the conundrums of Indian higher education. Because what the great pandemic tells us is that we need to understand the problems facing Indian higher education precisely from the lens of the pandemic, which tells us that uncertainty and not linear transitions that we expect from higher education are really what higher education has to tell us. Now, going back to 1973, I'm going back to the University of California at Berkeley, and for the OECD on the Carnegie Commission, as much as there was an industrial relations man called Clark Kerr, who refused an invite from the then president of the US to join his administration as the Secretary of State and stayed back in the regional arena of California, translating what were then dotting the geography of the state of California, the numerous entities that were community colleges, not so good institutions of higher education, then the standalone colleges, then the better universities and the research universities, all of it into a master plan. Now that master plan was not a craft of the great planning of that we've seen characteristic of the Russian system. But this was a master plan that thought of the stakeholders, that thought of what the geography was, what its variations were, and what socio-economic disadvantage was. Professor Ramaswamy made a mention of the first generation learners. Now here was a system that decided to respond to first generation learners through putting in place a system. Now it is this system that another sociologist at the same campus, Martin Troe, talks about in 1973, and he talks about systems of higher education to be seen in their wholeness, not the elites at the top. And what were these systems of higher education? Now, Martin Troe, just like you had Rostow for Economic Growth, talks about systems that about 15% continue to be elite systems. At about 26% that Pushkar, you opened your remarks with, they turn to be what are called mass systems. Anything above that is a universal system. Now, Troe was looking at the system from the perspective of participation. Now, at that point of time, you can see that TRO also begins to see that this participation puts immense challenges on the system. The system does not make linear transitions, but that so many come from diverse backgrounds and that the institutions are diverse puts forward many challenges. Now, what are the lessons that come to us from Martin TRO? Number one, think about the system as a whole. And that perforce tells us that in the same breath that we need to talk about an IIT, an IIT-Bombay at the top, we need to look at the Darbhanga Medical College, whose pictures you've seen at the time of this great pandemic. They are part of the same system. Now, unfortunately, great globalization meant that geographical assemblages of globalization believed that there was a continental drift of the top layer of Indian higher education, and they existed in an assemblage with the global top ones. Now, what has the great pandemic taught us? The great pandemic has taught us to take damn Darwin very seriously. We are all aboard the HMS Beagle, and we will survive as much as we look at the worst institutions amongst us together along with the best ones, number one. The second, look at variations. And as Professor Ramaswamy said, go back to the moment before the pandemic. How much were the Indian higher education scholars or policymakers engaging seriously with variations within? Go back to the damn Darwin once again. Go back to the great pandemic. What is it telling us? The second wave is a story of variations. And if you don't take those small hamlets where it's going to survive and proliferate, the challenge is going to come back and hit us, the uncertainty. And that uncertainty will tell us that linear transitions promised by higher education won't happen till we embrace what is the worst amongst us, those who are the strugglers amongst us, those who lie behind the veil of the digital divide. On the other side, eminent scholars like Professor Ashok Misra or Professor Ramaswamy delivering classes that are global, world-class in standard. On the other side, those who struggle for very life, the right to life. Now, I'll come to the last point here, and that in fact explains, I could at any point during the panel go back to the story of variations, extremely significant. My work that I did at the London School of Economics taught me to see the system from afar and understand that the divide of the Vindhyas had made for institutional mutations in education, be it school, and definitely far more pronounced in higher education. Now, sirs, this August panel here, I'd like you to urge and see and tell us why down to the south of the Vindhyas, including in West Maharashtra, where you're sitting, sir, we have a better institutional presence per lakh population. Come over to the north of the Vindhyas, you find quality to be a struggling problem. You find institutions, what could be 51 per lakh student population in Karnataka, goes down to a bare 7 in Bihar. And this problem of variation is not just a problem of numbers. As Martin TRO taught us, this wasn't a problem of numbers. This was a problem of the sociological imaginary. Now, I have, since the time that I came back from the LSE and started researching Indian higher education, the one missing that I found was that in the north of India, the last woman poet laureate coming out of an Indian university happened to be Mahadevi Verma. What is it that there is no poetry, especially coming from the heart and minds of a woman to the north of India? Certainly something that presses the button and tells us that we need to look at the bottom of the pyramid, and higher education needs to create what Karl Popper said, literally the open society, and have no fears in punching the bullies who are enemies of the open society. A thriving ecosphere of Indian higher education is what I see as the future, and I do not fear a crisis if I were to be a struggler or a slave of the higher education system in India.
Thank you, Dr. Priyam. Professor Ashok Misra mentioned early on a little bit on online education, online teaching, but the second question is more specifically about how India's higher education sector has coped with the great pandemic. And the most obvious visible way in which this happened was online teaching. But other than that, there's a larger story of what has been happening since March 2020, whether it is about examination schedules, it is about, teachers falling ill and even, passing away because of COVID-19, because of the deficiencies in our healthcare system and so on. Professor Ramaswamy, you have been, I went through some of your articles, the links to which you had sent, some of the articles you had written for the Hindu and Telegraph, and you talked a lot about, the learning process that is underway. Because this is something which was unexpected, and it is becoming unprecedented in its scope. The uncertainty factor, as Professor Ashok Misra pointed out, and as Dr. Priyam also noted, that there's a great deal of uncertainty about the whole thing. Now, given this larger context, and given the fact that the uncertainty factor remains very much in play with or without vaccination, you have also co-edited a book on online education that I skimmed through. And I think you would be the best person to talk about, what has been really going on in terms of the higher education system, to use Dr. Priyam's word, where you have the better funded universities and institutions such as the IITs and central universities on the one hand, and you have poorly funded colleges in different parts of the country, and private institutions, again, form a different set of institutions. So overall, how has the higher education sector coped in different ways with the pandemic? We'll begin with you, Professor, and then come to Professor Ashok Misra, and then finally to Dr. Priyam.
How has the higher education system coped? It hasn't. There is a very telling parallel that's happening over here. The way in which our healthcare system has crumbled under this, this year. And there is something for us to learn about it, because all of us are on the same page, so I will not refer to each one of us's points, but it has been made before, that we thought that this was going to go away when it started in March of 2020. We thought June, July, September, and people were booking tickets for Goa in December and so on and so forth. But that didn't happen, right? Now we realized that we were going through something that was longer lived, but frankly speaking, almost no institution in India prepared for the fact that it would go on for another year and a half. And just as the way in most of our hospitals didn't, most of our cities crumbled, we are seeing the fact of not having prepared our healthcare system. It has hit us in the face in the middle of India's Silicon Valley. It has hit us over here in Delhi, in the capital of the country. And you're right, we have lost teachers. Aligarh Muslim University has lost something like 50 faculty members, both serving and retired. JNU has, about 10. Delhi University, a very large number. So we have been, the parallel is significant. But there are many things that we could have done and we need to do. One of them is that to realize that we are going to go online for a fairly long time, either fully online or at least definitely in part, because we are going to try to reduce the amount of interactions that people have. So we are going to have to learn that online is a way in which we will go on. Having said that, what are the things that we can do? We can start by training our teachers to teach online. Yeah. We have absolutely, individual institutions will turn around and say, we did this, we did that. And, we had a session for some, some class or some group, and let it be. By and large, most institutions did not invest in teaching the teachers. And then we didn't also try to see what are the problems of the students. Now, as as Dr. Misra pointed out, students they are in different locations, they have differential access to the internet, they have families of different sizes, they have privacy issues. You know, coming to your class is not the only reason why people come to a university. People may come just to get away from home also, so that they can learn, you know, that they can study. All these issues we should have tried to figure out what to do. Jadavpur University, for example, made sure that every student has their individual laptop or cell phone. Just how difficult is that for, you know, any institution which is sensible to do it? Because the fact of the matter is that most people have to share their devices. Not and very few institutions have given their teachers money to buy laptops. So if you look at it from an infrastructure, you know, from a software point of view, teaching the teachers, we haven't done that. If you talk about it from a hardware point of view, that is enabling all our students, we haven't done that. And finally, the one thing is that if we are going to go online, there is a very big role that the government has to play. And I'm not talking about the state versus central versus X versus Y, etc. I mean, I couldn't care who. But if the bulk of your students, if your gross enrollment ratio, that dividend is sitting in the villages, can we make sure that there is internet in the villages? Can we see that the coverage, the network coverage is guaranteed? And can we ensure that the International Center Goa has uninterrupted power for the duration of one 1-hour seminar? You see, these are the issues that would make online learning and online teaching even possible. And I'm sorry I get passionate about it, because these are such small things. And very, very few institutions have actually addressed these as issues to try to solve. But I should stop now.
Professor Misra?
All right, let me start with something different. Higher education is the heart and the core of any nation. All the progressive nations have a very robust and strong higher education system. Well, education system as a whole, but since you're talking higher education, we in India are at the bottom. I think our higher education system needs a huge amount of reform. And just as an example, Prof. Ramaswamy is saying, teach the teachers in the internet teaching. We have not taught the teachers to teach well, even in the classroom. And that itself is a challenge. In a webinar recently, the number of universities, if you count all the universities, central, state, private, and the institutes of national importance, there is 1,076. Can we name 10% of these which we would say are of world class? Can we name 1 or 2 universities which would be full-fledged universities like the Cambridge or Oxford or Harvard or University of Paris, whatever, Singapore National University? The answer is no. So therefore, we just, as a country as a whole, forget the pandemic for the time being. Higher education system needs a huge amount of reform. And let me also address a little bit more provocatively, the leadership, overall leadership in the higher education system. I mean, handful of vice-chancellors and IITs and all that, you leave that behind. 1,076 universities are there, is not up to the mark, in my personal opinion. I may be provocative in this. The governance system in the universities needs a lot to be desired. Maybe the IITs and central universities are all right, but the rest of them. And you think private money has come in to do private universities, their governance system is also not off the mark. We talk of autonomy. Autonomy in private institutions is sometimes less than what you would get in a public institution. So these are the things, unless you have this, you have to have autonomy, you have to have competition between universities, you have to make them aspire to be at a higher level. And that just hasn't happened in the country. We had universities like BHU, I'll refer to BHU later in one of your questions, but right now, BHU, Allahabad Universities, I come from the northern belt, as Manisha said, Allahabad University, Lucknow University, I belong to Lucknow. They were well known. People used to go to Allahabad universities if they wanted to go for higher studies in science, or if they wanted to go to the IAS system and so on. BHU was an university where the best engineers would go for training and in the arts and sciences and so on. What have we done? We have done whatever we could do to bring them down. And then we open new universities and say, now we'll solve the problem. And those universities sometimes become non-starters. Why don't we fix the system? Why don't we take a BHU and say, it was one of the best in the country, let's make it the best today. Take Allahabad University, let us make it the best today. We don't do that. We say, okay, we'll have more innovation universities, more universities are coming up and so on. And Ram knows better than I do, some of the new central universities are wanting. Okay, I'm not talking about Hyderabad, but some of the newer, I won't name them, but there is a problem of innovative, forceful leadership. There is a problem of vision. Do they have the right vision? Do they have a strategy to take it forward? No, they're just moving along, and the term of one vice-chancellor finishes in 3 years, a new one comes and he moves along or she moves along and so on. So we have to fix that. And these are the things which the NEP does not address, how to fix that system. Once you fix the governance and the leadership, and that they should have the right vision and focus and strategy, I think we can fly. But we don't fix that, so we don't fly. We're just meandering. Pandemic just pointed it out, maybe enhanced it to some extent. Yes, we have coped with it, with the pandemic, but coped with what? We have not enhanced the quality. It's actually an opportunity in one sense that, okay, the pandemic showed you some of the flaws and so on. Let's try to fix them. If the pandemic will go away someday, but if we go back to the same old system, then what has pandemic taught us? So we could use this as an opportunity to take things forward. So we need to fix the higher system, higher education system to a large extent. Pandemic, we have coped with the pandemic. Okay, laptops have been given and online teaching is going on and some internet issues, and thanks to Zoom, if some of my friends in the States bought Zoom shares and they're zooming in money, their shares have gone 8x, 10x and so on. But that doesn't help our education system. So a lot needs to be done as we move forward. 1,076 universities in India, which are either deemed universities, this or that, or national institutes of national importance and whatnot. Not a small number. Even if 10% were of the highest world class, the number of students we have in colleges is more than the population of some countries. We have 30 million students. It's more than the population of Australia. Okay. And you say, okay, 10% of that 30 million, 3 million, we write recommendation letters, he's in the top 10% of the class, right? So 3 million, if 3 million students are of the top class, if we can produce from the university system, we would be flying, very high. So we need to do that.
And that's bigger than the population of some countries also.
That's what I'm saying. It's bigger than Australia. I took as an example. It's 25 million. We have 30 million students in colleges today.
No, I meant that the 3 million is larger than that.
Oh, yeah, 3 million is larger. Of course. So, okay, I think we'll come back to.
Okay, Dr. Priyam.
Provocative this time.
How, in your view, how have India's colleges and universities coped with the pandemic? And after that, we'll move on to the next question.
So I'll use a term which I will borrow from Rawls, the great philosopher who Amartya Sen sparred with and brought out his magnum opus, The Idea of Justice. I would say a great veil of ignorance today divides those who teach, people like us, for example, who've been on the other side of the digital divide, especially its upper echelons. And in my privileged existence as a teacher and a researcher and a globetrotter, it was for the first time that I realized, as Professor Mishra just said, that I was teaching without looking into the eye of those who I taught. And because I was teaching and because there was a stunned silence at the other end, I exercised my lungs and I finished an hour-long lecture, not just in 40 minutes, but because the moment I stopped, I realized there was a breath missed at the other end. And this was drama. This was breath. And I realized that if I finished earlier, the students didn't know what had come over them. So here was a situation where we began with a story of closed campuses, canceled classes, switched to digital and online. Now slowly, this was a batch of students who had never seen me and who did not know who I was. And the limited data that they had on their mobile phones sitting somewhere in Birbhum or somewhere in parts of Orissa or down somewhere in a village in Kerala, not even the privileged places. I realized that, normally in a class that would have taken maybe 2 classes to warm up and tell me what was wrong in a class, it took the students months to take away that veil. And I realized there was fear and trepidation. They did not know what was on offer. They did not know how to judge me. They did not know what to make of what I gave them. And the biggest tragedy was that things that I had struggled with, when I finished, I really wanted to be back. I still remember the PhD research committee, when I was walking out of LSE, had offered me a postdoc, wanted me to stay on there. I always believed I should be where my research questions were. And this was for the first time that I could see that those questions were coming back to haunt me. Things that I had said in my institution, I had said that the entire library needs to move online. For 4 or 5 years that I had been here, these demands were considered demands of privilege. I had said lots of student access to databases that are not just these journals of which if you've paid some amount, it means you have so many years. Students are not, online has its own advantages. And I realized that our students did not have the luxury of scrolling through walls of archives, something that I could do at my pace at the LSE. So institutions that were online and digital anyways, that had understood that universities are not the land grant models that were at their peak in the 1970s, those transitions needed to have been instituted prior to the crisis, prior to the pandemic. So here was a situation where we gave the lectures, but we were not certain of whether the student would be able to connect this lecture to a wider body of knowledge. And how did you expect them? Now, if we were good even in the physical sort of way, we could have had textbook packs being couriered to students, tie up with an Amazon, do the home deliveries of courier packs. Did we do anything to reach out to those who were on the other side of the digital divide? Unfortunately, very little. And, I realized in some time that all sorts of make-believe modes were being used. For example, open your Google Meets, write an exam by putting your camera there. If I were anybody to say anything to the system, I would have said, let this be open book. Can you make an exam that is analytical in nature? Can you tell the student that this exam is your homework? Come back to me after a week and I'm going to see your exam. Now, at the LSE, for example, one of the cultures we imbibed was, the weekend homeworks that were given to us, and we were told that you need to keep this in the tray at such and such time, or need to slip it under the door of the professor. And we were told that the Coase theorem came out of deliberations of these kinds. Now, did we give our students on the other side any models that we could look forward to? Neither did we give them the wider base of knowledge within which these lectures were to be instituted. Did we give them exemplars that they could emulate? No. But we were very strict with time. Punctually hold the exam. First one on the race. Despite the pandemic, we held our exams. Meant, therefore, that Indian higher education institutions failed even in their mission to respond to the nature of the crisis. And by the time the second crisis came, that veil of ignorance was lifted, and we found that from the other side of the divide, the students were willing to jump out and say, the teachers who Professor Ram just mentioned at the Aligarh Muslim University were gasping for oxygen cylinders. Where was this community of students? Where was that camaraderie of teachers who could save the lives of teachers dying? So you could see down the ladder, the worst deaths that happened were of school teachers in Uttar Pradesh who went on to supervise panchayat polls. I personally interviewed some families and found out that the trainings that were held with efficiency to hold the elections, those large trainings were where the teachers caught the infections. So I found that had Indian higher education responded to its teachers, to its students, and had it taken its mission of teaching, learning, research, and last but not the least, the most important, community engagement more seriously, the character of the first wave would have been something that Indian higher education institutions would have written up as term papers, research papers. And by the time the second pandemic hit us, were there any type of researches, for example, even simply tabulating the nature of crisis that was being faced by large campuses or by our own students, by our own teachers? Some of the features of the variant, be 0.1, 0.61, 7.2, came in the experience of suffering. There was no prior knowledge of what this variant would bring with us. Did the Indian higher education system come up with even rough papers, even academia letters that said that this is the nature of the variant that is about to hit us from small locations in Maharashtra or be it in Uttar? I don't know, I'm not aware. But what I found was a singular failing was that even non-peer reviewed papers that could bring us either the hard observational part, not even a science, and the social science of it was not available with us. So in teaching, yes, we taught very well. We taught with as much vigor as we usually do. But on the other side, there was a divide that was digital, and there was a larger veil of ignorance that told us that we knew nothing about the suffering of our students, our teachers. And as I conclude this point, let me tell you that I hold my head today down with shame that some of those who suffered the worst are my colleagues, not just first generation learners, sir. My colleagues, for example, I lost a NUEPA colleague 40 years of age. I could see him going. I was the one saying that, look, we need to organize, reorganize very quickly, get oxygen, get concentrators. Didn't come, got a concentrator from somewhere. The guy survives for a little while. People did not know, for example, how to interpret CT reports, did not know how to interpret the wider reports that were coming in. Had there been conversations between scientists, community medicine people, the Indian University at the time of the crisis would have become the great communicator with the vast arena of first generation learners. It's the Indian university system that would have been reading signs of the pandemic and would have been telling people about what to look out for, what to save yourself from, even if not the hospital, what to unanticipate. So I will make a plea today that the mission of the university be defined as teaching, learning, research, but also community engagement. And the mission of the Indian University for the next 2 years, sir, is not about the world class. Let it be the mission to build back better. And let some of the finest institutions at the top tell us of where we erred, where we missed out in holding that hand of the colleague who we learned later when he passed away that he belonged to the affirmative action category. And therefore, when he passed away, I realized that there was no family on either side to come up and say that we are going to hold the children together. We are going to look after this family. So it's not the first generation learners. A student of mine wrote to me last night saying that I'm the son of an Anganwadi worker from Bihar and my mother's died with an 18 SpO2 outside the doors of an eminent Bihar hospital. Tell me, how do I hold the class in engagement? How do I gain the trust and confidence of my students and tell them that for the next 40 minutes, except when I say that I'm going to teach you about the human condition? So we must be seen as responsive people. Intellectuals lead, and intellectuals who lead protect the world of higher education. That's the lesson following the two world wars. That's the lesson that came out of the United Nations when it decried the lack of an open society, the genocide, the Germans, the emigrants coming to United States, and rebuilding the purpose of American universities to be centered around the human condition. So I end with a plea by saying that yes, we erred, but we must build back better, and we must respond in community engagement and in responding to the human condition.
Thank you, Dr. Priyam. There are 2 or 3 audience questions on approximately the same topic. And it's not so much a question, but it's about the issue of mental health. And this has been said in passing. I mean, when we talk about uncertainty, when Dr. Priyam was telling us about, things that have been happening in campuses in Delhi and elsewhere, teachers falling ill, students falling ill. And in that context, we are talking about, also online learning and examinations and so on and so forth. As far as higher education institutions are concerned, are there many examples where the university or the college has addressed the issue of mental health of its teachers and students? Because as it is in India, mental health is very much a neglected issue for the larger population as well.
Embarrassing topic.
Yeah.
So, are there any positive, good examples of where an IIT campus, even an IIT campus, and we are talking about, elite institutions. I'm quite certain that at the level of, state universities and colleges, it was pretty much left, everyone was left to their own. But certainly at the level of IITs, IIMs, central universities, are there examples where the university administration took steps to address the mental health of the community, of its own people?
Yeah. Well, let me just start by let me take the question to my. Let me answer it now. The IIT Delhi, for example, has a very active group on which does counseling and organizes all sorts of events for its students and the faculty. But I was actually going to give you the example of Ambedkar University, which is a state university, Dr. Pushkar, which has a very fine department devoted to looking after the mental health of both teachers and students. During the past year, I've been running an online discussion, which resulted eventually in the book and other sort of articles in the Telegraph that you were alluding to earlier, where we been talking about issues like mental health, because we realize that actually students are they're having a lot of difficulties. The anxiety of not being able to attend exams, leading to the unfortunate suicide in one example at least, and a lot of other conditions that we are not always very sensitive to. So I know that many institutions, both largely the private ones because they are generally smaller and better endowed, they have been able to respond, but also institutions like the Ambedkar University. I know that many of the IITs have these cells. So it's not that they are not available. I think that people are not always forthcoming in trying to access them, especially access them in time. Seeking help for emotional or psychological issues is still not very easy in our country. But they are there, and I think that many university administrators realize that this is a major issue.
Yeah. So if I may come in, as Ram pointed out, IITs and ISC Bangalore and so on, several universities do have groups who are looking at mental health in the regular era, non-pandemic era. Pandemic era has taken it to the next level. There is a pandemic fatigue, there's a Zoom fatigue, being the students and the faculty staying at home day after day after, week after, month after, and so on. So that fatigue is actually playing on the minds of the students and the faculty and the general public and at large. And there have been some, I've seen, I've not attended some of them, but I've seen announcements of lectures on mental health at IIT Bangalore. So they're trying to do that. But the problem is so large and so vast that it's so difficult to do all this in the pandemic era. Those who are giving the lectures, they are themselves stressed out. Nimhans has done some lectures, and Nimhans is actually, there's a very, I encourage you to go see that there's a section of yoga and pranayam and so on. And they have every day lecture on these things, and also guide you to make yourself mentally strong. So things are happening, but the problem is so huge that it's not so easy to tackle. And there are not enough people around to help you to tackle it. One of the things that we have in our country, which I don't know if you realize this and all, and we should take advantage of that, that as per my knowledge and digging, in the social sciences in the country, we have 57 lakh female students and 47 lakh male students. Larger number of female students are there. In the sciences, about 25 lakhs each. And we have not taken advantage of the women to help solve some of the problems. You're talking about Mahadevi Varma. I think there are so many Mahadevi Varmas in the offing, but we have to look after them. We have a larger number of girl students in the university system, but you don't see them. I mean, when you're talking of greater than the country's population and so on. So we have to address those things also. I think we just need to do a little bit more. Not enough people to guide you through this crisis of mental health during the pandemic. But whatever best we can do, we should do, obviously, needless to say.
Well, yeah, I'll just, Pushkar, since you're muted, let me just take this and say that mental health, obviously you require to have good sympathetic faculties in psychology, especially as the Ambedkar University has. It has one of the finest faculties in this regard. They've been doing a lot of student engagement activities. So wherever these activities were in place even prior to the pandemic and the crisis, those are the places that have been able to do better. Now, one of the things that I saw, because, we got into the thick of it for various reasons. I had families in Uttar Pradesh and in Bihar, and I could see that there was some sound coming even around the first week of April, and that sound was dissonance. That sound was suffering. And by the time the pandemic hit New Delhi, where I live, I already had members of my extended family who were dying or were literally dead. And these were all cousins. These were all people who were 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. So there was some sense in which I realized that there needed to be men and women of science who could have spoken to people to make meaning of the loss. Because dying with this pandemic also, I'm sorry to bring back death in the middle of a discourse that's really about higher education and optimism of the future. But death needs meaning making, because one thing that went away was the usual community resources of the family huddling around you at the moment of death. All the rituals were not there. So we followed all the advice about, don't gather around, don't hustle, allow a person to die in silence. But then what? How does the family make meaning of this? How do you understand what happened, what failed, the suddenness of it? I mean, many of these were really about, oh, my son or my brother or my nephew was getting all right, and then he suddenly passed away, number one. Second, the callousness of interaction with the system. You know, there were people who asked us for admissions into leading medical institutions in one of the states that I have named, but I will not again. And after they got admission, the next call was, now we got admitted, can you get us an oxygen cylinder for our father in that hospital? Now, I have nothing to say. It's all out there. But losing your loved one after putting them in the hospital and for lack of oxygen. Now, you know, these are things that have hit doctors of stature so hard, because the doctors are people like us. They are men and women of science. They've been trained to save the human life and not to lose it in a callous sort of way. So if we accepted, as I said earlier, that we erred, and if men and women of science, rather than the pretend ones who we're not going to name on the show here, came and spoke to, for example, you know, Professor Misra here as an eminent educationist and director of the IITs, Professor Ramaswamy here as a man of science. If there could be Zoom video lectures connected to the higher education system that can just be played out in these areas where we've had the worst hit of the pandemic without taking names, how to understand what hit us, where did we err? So I think it will allow people, remember, not everybody who died is a complete illiterate. They've been through the system. You know, they are educated people. They are in remote disadvantaged geographies of India, but they're not illiterate people. They've been through higher education. So I think meaning making is very important. It's not just that there are counseling mechanisms or mental support mechanisms that failed. Families failed. You know, there are husbands who failed their wives because they didn't want to accept a wife who had corona. The Indian Express has carried a story. How do I make sense of losing my own son in front of my own eyes? And lastly, people who've been through the hospitals, my young colleagues in Delhi who've battled, braved, and survived the ICUs have lived through stories of death, how the person by their side passed away while they lived on to see them helplessly. And the lack of dignity in death, I think that has hit people very hard. There are others who say that, you know, for them to not understand where the dividing line between life and death lies. So I think the whole building back better exercise is something that universities in India, public universities, the IITs, the eminent men and women of science can take as their mission and speak to societies. Their societal engagements must be far wider. Remember, the lecture, the predictability of the term or the semester is something that the corona has already knocked and taken out of our lives. So what must we do that is different? How must we build back that society? And the one hope that I have in Indian society, even as our systems have failed us to a large measure, is that since about 1914, I've seen that the Indian society, despite the tyranny of the colonial rulers, despite the oppressive nature of the First World War and the sedition laws of the British rulers, some of the finest non-government institutions of higher education were built by people's energies and popular energies being reposed. Of course, there were leaders like the Maharaja of Baroda or the Maharaja of Mysore, but there were stellar intellectuals, and those stellar intellectuals were people of the kind of Visheshwaraya, the man of science. All his friendship with the Governor General, ultimately it was the university village, in the words of Newman, that he went on to create. The making of Mysore, for example, where 3 years down the line, the great philosopher Radhakrishnan would come and think alongside the Indian tradition, along with the tenets of the theory of relativity. So I think the sociological imagination, the communitarian commitments of the Indian university will lead in their optimism to build back better men of science, women of science, men of eminence, men of social commitment must talk to their societies in large public lectures through digital platforms and build back better for the sense of bereavement that we share together.
Thank you, Dr. Priyam. I just received a message on via Zoom by Professor Ramarao Wag, who's the principal of College of Theatre Arts in Panjim here in Goa. And he said that in his college, they did make a real effort at counseling students and teachers.
Very good.
They have been doing that, and with some degree of success. But there's another question, sort of an observation, and it's a very popular one. I think it will go for many of those who are listening to this. Has the pandemic made exams, board exams, exams of any kind, irrelevant, or have they really transformed the relevance of examinations as we know it, as we knew it? After all, I mean, when we look at IITs or when we look at several other, I mean, if somebody wants to go abroad, you have to, other than your +2 exams, you need, you have a separate entrance exam and so on and so forth. So that purpose of the +2 exam or any other exam, in fact, in the pandemic, post-pandemic era, is it going to be changed because of our experience, the current experience? But also, I just wanted to make a quick note that perhaps in the rebuilding process in India, post-pandemic, mental health will perhaps need to be given far more attention than it has been.
Absolutely.
I know that Professor Vikram Patel, who started Sangat, this organization in Goa, which deals with mental health, he has for long been advocating, greater emphasis on mental health in India. But the pandemic has obviously, told us that there is that extreme need in times like this to deal with sorrow, to deal with loss, to deal with uncertainty. It cannot always be done within one's family or within one's community, within one's circle of friends. So that is something I thought I would mention. But going back to exams, Professor Misra, and then
in India, the education system, now I'm going to exams at the secondary level, it's always been boards and this and that control, we have talked about giving autonomy to colleges sometimes in the university system, but sometimes it's only a talk, it's not taken place. You look at the American system, there's no board. Every school gives the marks in as honesty as possible, and that is what, and you sit in the SAT examination equivalent to the JEE and so on, and then you go on into college. So I think this kind of a huge reform can be taken up, but then autonomy comes with a lot of responsibility. I'll just give you an example. I was dealing with a college which became autonomous. Earlier, the exam papers were set by somebody else and they would come, and the teachers were used to taking tuition of the students. Now, after becoming autonomous, the person, at least some professors, some faculty members, continue to take tuition, and they were also the paper setters. Now, huge conflict of interest. These things have to change, but it will take some time, but it can be done if there is a willingness to do it. But the honor system or the teachers will have to take a huge leap in this direction. I think it's possible. I just wanted to relate one story, what Manisha was so passionately saying. There is a doctor lady, Brahma Mukherjee at University of Michigan. She was on one of the channels yesterday. She's a biostatistician, biostatics she does. And she's been studying the Indian pandemic, COVID pandemic, and doing all the numbers and so on. And I heard her on a talk show. Then she said one day she got a call from her father that she's got COVID. Suddenly she realized that it's just not the numbers. Her father had become one of the numbers in the statistics, And that's the kind of thing you have to worry about, that people have to, suddenly she was taken aback. People have to be like, people are, you're in the second wave, people that you knew, faculty members in the colleges you're dealing with, relatives, friends, their wives, their family members are affected by COVID, and many passing away. And that puts a lot of stress on the mind. And we do have to take care of that mental health at all levels, not just the school, colleges, but at all levels. It has to be done. But coming back to the exam system, yes, it can be solved, but there has to be a willingness to solve it in a as honest, as honor bounds way as possible. There will be exams, but there'll be local exams. You know, every school will have their own exam. They'll be much easier to deal with rather than a whole board exam.
Yeah.
Professor Ramaswamy?
Yeah. No, see, many universities have gone for the so-called open book examination. I mean, but this is not, what they've done is not really open book exams. They've just done whatever they could. I agree with Professor Mishra. It has to be solved at a local level because an examination is a very particular thing. It is a evaluation of a given student by a given teacher in the best system. And if the teacher has evaluated the student fairly and well, then his evaluation or her evaluation will stay regardless of who else then chooses to evaluate them. So, I mean, this is the general idea that we have between, you know, SATs or what have you, other examinations. The numbers that you get there are not usually very different from what good, fair evaluations are. Our country has this problem of numbers, and the very limited access that we give to the universities, especially for things like medicine or for the IIT. When you've got, you know, n lakh students appearing for a few thousand seats, that's what causes this sort of, you know, complete I mean, that's what makes all these, internal evaluations untrustworthy, and people then go for board exams and stuff like that. I feel that it has to be solved at the local level. There is simply no way that it can be solved by artificial intelligence or having smart cameras asking, all that stuff is just, right now in our country right now, it's all science fiction. And even the so-called open book exam that people are following now, it's not actually viable because, again, on this program that we run, we had the registrar of Madras University appearing, and he said that, look, the students have got to write their question, the answers, and then upload all these answers using the internet. They've got to go to internet cafes to submit their question paper. I mean, this is not a way to evaluate anybody or anything. And, after all this is done, how carefully can teachers read if you've got, unknown students? So I think we have to find out a way in which institutions will have to reimagine the examination. We've got to have conversations with teachers, with students, and with educationists, and try to figure out a way forward. Because, last year, people were joking, especially when they thought that the pandemic was going to go, that, I'll try to, if I have to find a specialist later on, I'll find out the year in which they graduated, and I'll avoid anybody who graduated in 2020. The joke was usually about medicine and, or something like that, right? But it's not a joke anymore, because it's going to be many years when we've got this kind of learning going on. So let's invest a little time and also figure out how to examine the students properly.
Pushkar, I'll go to the minutiae of the examination experience that I've had as a teacher who's just teaching MPhil and PhD students. And therefore, my experience of the examination is not about the entrance exams for the IITs or grading or conducting exams on mass scale. These were small scale in any case. Now, here also, I think I'm going to take up from where Professor Ram left off, that speak to the teacher about their experience of having taken the exam. Now, what was the experience? The experience tells me that very minute issues need to be fixed first before you can go on to an open textbook exam. Now, what is the number one minute that needs to be fixed and that is ignored so much on the landscape of Indian higher education? the library system. The libraries, for example, when I came in and I was a fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, I was astonished and shocked to see that Boolean algebra-led search terms were not on use in one of your most eminent institutions that takes pride in calling itself a library. So I realized that they were still in the physical land grant system. Now forget that. Even if they were in the physical land grant system, if I'm thumbing through a particular shelf of the library, suppose on the topic decentralization, I must be able to find every piece of literature written on decentralization from the 1960s up until date. Now, what is the big missing on one of those shelves? I find that the best talking of this library on this topic has happened in a particular time frame when there's been someone interested in this topic. I go and ask them that, can you give me a copy of Pranab Bardhan and Dilip Mukherjee 2006 on democratic decentralization, or experiences, comparative experiences around the world on decentralization. I find that neither has the library applied a mind which is based on mathematical logic, which is used to organize libraries around the world, nor has it physically built up stacks that can take you through systematic evolution of an idea. So unless you have your physical stacks built up well, the students actually don't know how to thumb through knowledge. You need to have a text before you have an open text. Now, the second thing and most important that I've already made a mention of, the funding problem has its biggest impact at the institutional level on libraries. Which journal? The subscription will be stopped when? I mean, the biggest impoverishment that I felt after coming back from the LSE to an eminent institution here was that you can scroll through an important journal and you will find that a number of years are just missing. And the explanation for that will be, oh, we did not have the fund, so it was discontinued from such and such year. And when you go back and tell them that you need to paste this back, I cannot write an international paper, or my student cannot develop a linear progression of this concept or this idea unless we can track this back. So neither do you have the book wall physically built, nor do you have the journal wall physically built. Now, what is the student left with? The student is then left with technologies called LibGen and something else, which were all by the time of pandemic round one. There was a court case in Delhi, I can't remember, in the High Court here, which and LibGen was asked to withhold this subscription. So the students came back and said, oh, that last mile remedy that we had to access all the books that you're talking about, even that has gone out of our hands. Now, libraries can systematically spend to acquire e-copies of texts. If the students and the teachers had met and agreed that in a crisis year, let us go back and become minimalist. Let us agree on certain core texts that we will do for this. And if money had been spent on acquiring e-copies of those texts, only then could the conditions for open text exams have been built. Last but not the least, exams are de-linked from bodies of knowledge. That I have established by telling you of what a disjuncture exists between the world of the library and the world of the exam. Let me also tell you, Indian exams are bundles of rules. Who is the honorable registrar, the great honorable registrar, to speak on behalf of the faculty? If I were taking an exam anywhere in the world, it would be between my supervisor and me. And the hardest and strictest, remember always, internal examination is not always about the teacher showing his bounty of grace to those being examined. I mean, I as an examinee, for example, have straddled along two worlds. One of my supervisors is the most eminent demographer working on censuses of India and all over South Asia, and the other one an ethnographer. The two could never meet eye to eye. And therefore, any paper that I got was evaluated on two different parameters. My own understanding of concepts, my own understanding of how I needed to progress in research was built on an understanding of contradictions, was built on an understanding that in social science research, it is not certitude that you look for. You begin to understand and unravel uncertainty and complexity. How do you do it? Now, our job as teachers of higher education is precisely to open this frontier of knowledge, to not have our students live in the fear of a nanoparticle, but to be able to overcome this. Now, just when we built them into fearless entrepreneurs of higher education, that they could fly off on their own, we have the exam as a bundle of rules. So you have the most creative teachers and you ask them to be subservient. Who formed these? You have to give this for 20 marks, this for 10 marks, this will have so much weightage. Why? It's an unusual year. Can you just say, there were exams that I took internally where I said, I'm giving you these 3 concepts. Can you write even 4 to 5 line explanations of how to define a concept? Allow me to engage my students with my creativity, but ultimately I or the teacher is responsible that when the student becomes a researcher, a PhD research will go to external examination. And the external examiner will come back and say that your supervisor or a research methodology teacher did not teach you anything. So ultimately, if we do badly, it will reflect on us. Why should we do poorly? So have faith in us, the teachers, as Professor Ram said, have faith in us. Tell us, train us to think differently about the exams. We are willing to be in training systems. We are willing to be in conversations with our peers here in the IITs, in the sciences, in the arts, in the social sciences, in India, in abroad and abroad. Negotiate those with what is available here. Allow us to tell you what you need to acquire for the libraries. Allow us to tell you how we want to examine our students. Then you hold us to scrutiny. No problem. We are open to learn. We are open.
One of the things, I just make 1 minute remark. One of the things we talk about this examination system and all that, and we are all sitting at the Citadel. We should also involve the students in the conversation. What do you guys want? You know, what do you all want? Why do you think maybe they can come up with a solution? We never do that. We say, okay, no, we know what is best. So that's also something which needs to be done.
No, in general, you're right, Ashok. We are not talking to students at all. I mean, I know there are exceptional universities, JNU being one of them, where students are always consulted on matters of curriculum and syllabus and so on. But, you know, right now, for example, the class 12 exams have been cancelled. Now, it's okay, I'm not going to disagree or agree with that. It's not within my purview. But these are all solutions that should come up from the system and not from on top.
Right. That's what I was.
You know, because the fact that the student doesn't have a 12th class grade is going to live with them for a very long time.
Yeah.
You know, and it's easy to say that, oh, you know, we don't have the exam this year and so on. But have you thought it through? You know, and especially if a person has not been through the system, they don't know how important it is to have your 12th class marks. So there is, I mean, I think that there were better solutions that were possible, and we should have looked at some of them.
Thank you, everyone. One last question, and perhaps one from the audience, if we can finish in about the next 10-15 minutes. This is about India's higher education post-pandemic, and Professor Ramaswamy pointed out, right at the beginning, that one of the main challenges has been adequate funding. From the other side of the fence, you often have people who say that, and there was this report about some British universities a couple of days ago that throwing money at the problem will not make the problem go away. So, you know, there are competing views, but we do know that India's higher education is by and large not well funded. In fact, we can say that it's poorly funded. And all we have to do is look at our public universities beyond our central universities and, you know, the major state universities. I think we can count perhaps 30, 40 of at least as far as the public sector is concerned, 30, 40 universities. And after that, it's literally, you know, you get depressed just looking at what these institutions look like. walking in their corridors or going to the library or, using their washrooms. But my question is something else. One of the arguments being made, and I have to admit I have made this argument, is that in the post-pandemic era, we'll see a steep demise, further demise of public institutions and accelerated privatization. Without being judgmental about the merits of private and public universities, whether it's about costs and quality, but we do know that the private sector has an important role to play, that more and more students are opting for the private sector. But and the logic is as follows: in the post-pandemic period, the government will have very little incentive to look at the problems in the higher education sector, simply because for all governments, for all political parties, it's not a sector where, where you do something and you get rewarded for it. There are no electoral benefits from investing in education or higher education. We broadly say that the Indian voter has become wiser over time, that development issues, broadly speaking, do matter in elections and so on and so forth. But clearly, for most of the country, education is not one area where the government needs to do anything to win elections. So do you agree with this somewhat pessimistic view of India's higher education, especially public universities in the post-pandemic era?
I've actually written about this, Dr. Pushkar. So, my worry actually starts from the fact that the amount for education is always pegged to a fraction of the GDP. And if your GDP is going down, both in real as well as in effective terms, whatever you are planning to put into higher education is going down. And the model of for the past several years now has certainly been that reduce the amount of committed money and increase the amount of money that the university has to raise on its own, whether as a loan or as, I'm talking about the public universities. There is this higher education funding agency, HEFA, which will be funding all sorts of loans from, basically it's a middle person between banks and institutions. Finally, the student will have to pay one way or the other. And let's face it, most of our students cannot pay. There are a large number of students who can pay, and many of the private universities target those students who can pay. But the students who need the education are those who actually cannot pay, not now, and unless the economy changes very drastically, not in the future. I think a wiser government would realize that it is in their best interest to educate people, as many as possible, in a cost-effective manner. Just as it would be, vaccinating everybody today free of cost would be the most sensible way to try to get out of this phase of the pandemic. So each problem has its own sort of preferred solution, and unless the government invests more, the people who need the education will not be able to access it. It's not complete pessimism. I believe that what the pandemic has taught us is that technology could come to our help. It could become possible to use judiciously, and the important word is judiciously, some mixture of online, offline education, so that you can reach people at a reasonable price. Regardless of how you see it, private institutions very rapidly become unaffordable, because private institutions also typically work outside the kind of framework of the governmental organizations. Many of them pay their faculty much less than what the government does. And some of them pay much, much more. So either way, these are unsustainable models. And I think that if we can use technology to reach a larger number of people post-pandemic, we could start approaching the kind of access to equitable access that we've all been dreaming of for a while. Okay, let me stop here for a moment.
So
Dr. Priya?
I'll take your question in two parts. First, the first one about public and private provision. I do believe that following the pandemic more so, the state will have to invest very heavily in cutting edge higher education as well as equal basic provision. Not just this, the state will have to invest very heavily in assisting the online transition of the Indian university system. Let me come to you with a piece of statistic that comes from the International Association of Universities, the International University Association, the IUA, assisted by the UNESCO, the COVID-19 Global Higher Education Report. Now, in Africa, across the continent, uh, higher education leaders, institutional leaders, and practitioners said that almost 43% of the classes was suspended or cancelled were 24%. Together, the category of suspended and cancelled made for a hopping 67%. Now, how many answered that they switched to online? Only 29%. Now, you contrast this with the other end, that is in the Americas, you find that in the US, 72% of the same survey answered that they had switched to online, and therefore only 22% suspended and only 3% canceled classes. So together, just about 1/4 as compared to 67% in Africa. And let me tell you that when you talk of a 67% suspension or closure of classes, and when you talk of a low switch to online, my understanding is that the bigger culture has been on the continent of the Africas of one of absolutely closed classrooms for higher education throughout the period of the pandemic. Add to this the inequities of vaccine distribution. It's a continent that has continued to believe that it will be in the physical mode, and its ability to be able to resume the physical mode is also that much weaker. So there is no question that this has to be done. And remember always, as I opened when I said that we need to look at India and its variations. There is within India, parts of India very much compared to the Africa that I speak about. And who is going to invest in the transition of the university from being low caliber or average? The larger ecosystem will need to make the transition. Those investments will have to come from the state. Now, I will also at the same time say that I have no certitude here. The colleague that I referred to you about, all of 40, who we lost to the first few days of the pandemic, a young man who we later realized belonged to the affirmative action categories. Now, 15 days, a fortnight after he passed away, as his colleagues, we were writing to him, referring to him in the past tense as late such and such, and writing to the school where his children went for free ships. And let me assure you that more than the institutions that are publicly funded or the government, it's the private philanthropy, a land grant, comparable to none other. I assume that a lot of the NCERT and NUEPA exist on the land grant from the Aurobindo Ashram, as much as Madan Mohan Malviya created the BHU on land grants that he begged around for. The Aurobindo Ashram wrote back a letter saying that we are waiting to see how much the government decides to take on the responsibility of such children. But let me assure the widow of late such and such that her children will not be found wanting of any support from our institution. And I find that governments, institutions are inflexible, rule-bound, whereas philanthropies and private actors with a true spirit of philanthropy come out to lend a hand with an ethic of care. And there I believe very truly that higher education institutions in India need to learn from their philanthropic origins. Many of them have their past pathways embedded in trusts and philanthropies, and that part of the history of institutional architecture of higher education in India be it a Visvesvaraya, be it a Rabindranath Tagore, must be something that we embed in ourselves as we become practitioners of higher education. We ought to be different. We ought to be philanthropic. And ethic of care needs to transform the higher education landscape in India.
Professor Misra, I think we might have lost Professor Misra. Professor Misra, can you hear me? Okay, we are just past 90 minutes of this session, and I hope in the next 1 minute we have Professor Misra back, so I can thank him for spending 90 minutes, actually 90 minutes plus the additional 15 earlier. Okay, I think we might have lost him. Anyway, thank you so much, Professor Ramaswamy, Dr. Priyam, for joining us, and Professor Misra, if you can hear me. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and answering all these questions. We had several questions from the attendees. Some overlapped with the issues that were being discussed. And I think I included about 3 or 4 questions in between through the remarks I made. In 1 or 2 cases, I may have mentioned names, but forgive me if I forgot to at that particular moment. I hope you everyone enjoyed this session. It was very insightful, and insightful is a common word, but the various questions that were posed about coping with the pandemic, beyond the pandemic, and so on and so forth. I think it was interesting to see different perspectives come in from Professor Ramaswamy, who has spent a lot of his career at a very elite public university, and Professor Misra, again, who has been at IIT Delhi for a long time and headed IIT-Bombay, two very, very elitist organizations, institutions, and Dr. Priyam, whose research has been on education broadly. In fact, one of the reasons why I got her in was because of the title of her book itself. And we did not get any time to discuss the national education policy, which is all right.
Thank God.
That is going to be one area where you'll have a lot of arguments and counter arguments about everything. I did want to ask a question about multidisciplinarity at IITs and at JNU, where you have an engineering program being introduced, and some of the IITs at least trying to have more arts and humanities courses and degrees. IIM Bangalore, I'm told, is starting with a liberal arts program. So changes are taking place on that front. But enough said, and thank you once again, everyone, and Professor Misra too, if you are within earshot, and Dr. Priyam and Professor Ramaswamy. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye, Professor Ram.